Welcome to Book Banter with me, your host, Dianne Burkhart. I hope you will join me every Wednesday as we explore all things to do with, well, books. Let's get on with our show today. Hello, my happy people. Today is April 17th, 2024. And where is this month going? Oh my gosh. Whenever I am super busy with lots of interviews, I lose track of days and I look up and suddenly 2 weeks have gone by and I feel like I've missed most of the days. If you are watching my blogs, you will know that I kind of missed my Manic Monday vlog this week. I did do it on Tuesday. I did catch up, but I completely forgot to do it on Monday. So yeah, it's that kind of a week right now. But the great thing is that's because I have got so many incredible interviews coming up. You just will not believe who's going to be in the lineup pretty soon. So be sure to stick around until the end of today's episode and I will tell you about some of the great authors that we have coming up. But for now, we need to get on with today's interview because it is absolutely incredible. This is the first time I have ever had a team of authors come on together. I've interviewed author teams before, but it's always been one-on-one. But today I talked to both men behind A.J. Landau and the book Leave No Trace. The authors are Jeff Ayers and John Land, and they were so much fun to talk to, so I'm not going to waste any more time. Let's get straight to their interview. Please welcome the writing team behind A.J. Landau, Jeff Ayers, and John Land. The way that I usually start out is I have the author introduce themselves and tell the audience who they are and what they do. So why don't we start with Jeff?
Hi there. So my name is Jeff Ayers, and I am a retired public librarian. My first book was a guide to the Star Trek novels. It was a reference book that looked at all the novels that had been published up to that point, and I read over 550 of them for that project, as well as interviewing over 350 people, including William Shatner, which was fun in itself. And I'm the co-executive director for Thriller Fest, which is the International Thriller Writers annual conference that they hold in New York every year. And then also I'm half of A.J. Landau with John Land.
And John?
Yeah, I've had a little more experience. I've lost count. I think it's 65 books. It might be 66. Another one coming out in August, followed by another one in January. And then the second in this series will be February. But here's the thing. I could talk about the old series, all the things that I've done, my failures, my successes. But the bottom line is, this is a business based on today, not yesterday. And when Jeff approached me about working with him on the National Park series, starting with Leave No Trace, I saw it as, I would like to say a second chance, but more like a seventh or eighth. Another opportunity to grab the brass ring that had eluded me in the past. And the thing about this business is before you can become successful, before you can remain successful, you have to be relevant. You have to remain relevant. You have to be somebody who's willing to adapt to conditions, someone who's willing to change with the times. And I got very lucky that Jeff came to me about this series at a time when I was searching for a new identity. I didn't know at that point it was literally going to be A.J. Landau, our pseudonym for the two of us in this series. But the opportunity to write something that I felt was fresh and original and mold it from the start without the baggage of my own name so people would have expectations that might be unrealistic because this was a new start. I'm really grateful to Jeff for the opportunity to do it. And I love how Leave No Trace, I love the final product. I love everything about it. When you start out any book, you have a vision. You have a rough idea of what you want it to look like. It's kind of like building a house without any blueprints, without any plans. You don't know what it is you're building, at least when I write. And Jeff was patient with me with that. So I love the house that we built with Leave No Trace. The structure of it is strong. It checks every box of a thriller fan's dream book, which is what we wanted to do. And I'm having a blast writing the second one.
You know, and I do have to admit that I agree with you that it does give a thriller reader everything that they want. And I tend to be super critical of these kinds of books because I actually am certified in forensic criminology.
Ooh.
And I did extra studies for profiling and sex crimes. So I actually have a background in a lot of investigative practices. And so when I'm reading these kinds of books, I'm always like, oh, you can't do that. That's that's not what they do, and reading this, I did not have those thoughts. I just enjoyed the story and got sucked into it.
I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah, and I think I'll let Jeff touch on how we managed to please even the expert audience because we really were painstaking in it. We were very fortunate to get a whole 14 blurbs, advanced quotes, 10 of them from #1 New York Times bestselling authors. Literally 10 from authors who had been #1 on the Times list.
That's
but
amazing.
The one that meant the most to me, following up on this, was from a professor who actually teaches at Georgetown University. And she teaches national security. She teaches homeland security.
Oh, wow.
And she gave us a blurb that was so perfect. It meant more to me. The fact that she was saying she might even use our book in her class about domestic terrorism. It was just, to me, that was more important. Maybe not as relevant, to use that word again, maybe not as relevant to a pop culture audience as those #1 New York Times bestselling quotes. Mm-hmm. But that quote meant more to me because it showed that someone who was an expert in the field in real time had vetted our book. But Jeff, that wasn't an accident, was it?
No, one of the things about the research behind this book was trying to get as much of the details as right as possible. Mm-hmm. And so that meant me visiting the national parks, talking to the rangers. I actually got to be a park ranger for a day at Mount Rainier.
Oh, cool.
And there's, so we'll talk about characters in a minute, I'm sure, but Michael, who's our main lead, is an ISB agent, which is the Investigative Services Branch of the National Park Service, which is their FBI. And I got to interview one of the directors of that organization as well as shadow one at a park. Then we also had them vet the book. We also reached out to the National Park Conservation Association, and they looked over the book as well and gave us some feedback. And then we also had a former FBI agent do it as well. And so basically we had experts in every aspect that we wanted to make sure we got right, read it and give us feedback to make sure we weren't goofing up in any way.
See, and when you read this, that comes through. I mean, the way that it is laid out and the procedures and talking to each other about the hierarchy and all the problems of having to go through all the proper channels when you're investigating something like what occurs in the book. I love that.
So glad.
And Jeff and I are the perfect team because Jeff grounds me in a measure of reality, which is a big challenge because I tend to make stuff up. I back into situations where I'll write something and then I'll figure out how to make it credible. Mm-hmm. I live by the great credo spoken by Robert Louis Stevenson. It doesn't matter to me if you believe what I'm writing is true. All that matters to me is that you do not disbelieve it. And that's where the phrase, the suspension of disbelief, comes from. But in this book, you don't really have to suspend disbelief very long because although it gets very high scale, the ultimate stakes are involved. It never deviates into camp. It never deviates into what the James Bond series became for a great number of years in the Roger Moore series. We did have one scene. Now, I got to tell you this story, Diane, because Jeff had a rule. He had a rule. I was only allowed.
Love the story.
I was only allowed to partner with him on one condition. He only had one condition for me. Mm-hmm. I have a tendency in my books to always use organic animals, giant spiders, killer beetles, you name it. I've used nature in some twisted, thrillerdom way.
Yeah.
So I promised I would have no killer animals. And then I called him one day and said, Jeff, you're going to hate me. But don't hate me a lot until you read the scene. Because I had gotten to the point, Michael is a disabled hero. Mm-hmm. He lost a foot in the same incident on Mount Rainier that killed his wife. That comes back into the book. Thriller fans will know that as an important plot point. But beyond that, his foot was so badly damaged in the shootout, they had to amputate it. So he is, to my knowledge, the only disabled hero in thriller fiction today. So as we're approaching the climax of Leave No Trace, he's up against this giant maniacal killer who's probably claimed about 10 lives, 50 lives, more lives already, because he was responsible for the bombing at the Statue of Liberty, which opens the book. Mm-hmm. There's no way. Michael's lost his prosthetic foot. He's using a branch as a crutch. How's he going to beat this guy? How's he going to take him on? Well, when I called Jeff, I said, I did some research into Zion, and I found the perfect animal that allows, and I don't want to give it away. Jeff hates when I give it away, but I'm not going to so I won't do that, but I will say it has been called the most creative way of killing someone that some readers who read a lot of these have ever seen. And in fact, right from the beginning, Dianne, there was a trend. They did a Goodreads campaign, Minotaur, our publisher. So we were getting dozens and dozens of advanced reviews months before the book came out. Mm-hmm. And most of them were extremely positive, but all of them said the same thing, even the ones that weren't as positive as we had liked. They loved the scene I just described, much to Jeff's chagrin. And Jeff, why don't you pick up with the other thing that they loved?
In addition to that scene, which, even an editor for a place I review said, oh my gosh, what are you thinking for that scene? So each chapter of the book opens with a factoid about where the chapter is set. And one of the things I love about really great thrillers is you come away learning something as well. So you've had great time dealing with the thrills and action, but also, wow, I actually learned something about something. And so one of the things John and I talked about was wanting people to learn about the National Park Service and what they do, because most people don't know that they oversee over 430 locations, including national monuments like the Statue of Liberty or Devil's Tower, for example, historical sites. You can learn all about the Revolutionary War in a bunch of places, or Gettysburg is a historical site, and then, of course, the national parks. So each chapter opens with a factoid, and a lot of folks in their reviews have said they really appreciate that aspect of the book.
I actually had that fact here in my notes that I wanted to talk about that, because I thought those little historical notes at the beginning of each chapter was so interesting, because it's a great way to add some educational knowledge in with the fiction fun, so that it's not like you're being force-fed anything. It's just a interesting little fact every once in a while. And I am horrible about remembering things like this. And I was going into my husband's like, hey, did you know that this is true about this monument? And he was just looking at me like, where is this coming from? It's like, oh, it's the book that I'm reading right now. He's like, oh, okay.
That's awesome.
See, but I think that those kinds of things, whenever you can add in educational bits along with the fiction, it just makes it more interesting.
It also, in this book, the thing that really is special, though, Dianne, is that the kind of things we're doing, it's organic. For instance, the secondary hero, I shouldn't say secondary, she shares the stage about 50-50 with Michael, is Gina Delgado. Gina is the assistant special agent in charge of the New York field office, the biggest office in the country of the FBI. She is the youngest woman and first female Latina who's ever reached that high a level. But a book like this, which is about bombings, which is about attacks on national monuments and memorials like the Gateway Arch, like the opening scene in the Statue of Liberty, which is a story in itself. We should get to that. Independence Hall in Philadelphia. The thing that's most important is you need to have someone who knows explosives, because someone has to be the eyes and ears of the reader. Someone has to be the POV for what's going on with all the big booms. Mm-hmm. Well, normally in a thriller like this, you have a third character who's an explosive expert. We decided to make Gina our explosive expert. And here's where the organic nature of the book comes in. That led us to draw her background in one of the most unique ways I've ever seen a hero introduced, in the sense that her father was an excavation expert. He did demolitions for buildings. So after her mother died and she was raised by a single father, he would take her to job sites and she fell in love with his work. And as a little girl, she was building bombs out of firecrackers in the basement. And there's a great little twist in the book about the first time she actually uses an explosion to hurt people and why she does it. And it really organically creates a character who you not only understand is an expert in her field and why, but you understand who she is as a person, what drives her. She was also the first woman to ever serve with a Special Forces A team in Iraq, where she really got her biggest experience in explosives as an expert over there during the surge, 06, 07, 08. She was over there somewhere in that general range. And then she joined the FBI. So just like Michael's rich background, which ties in directly to the nature of the book, so too does Gina's background tie in organically to the nature of the book.
You know, one thing that we've been really talking about a lot in season 3 on this podcast is the importance of inclusivity and representation in fiction. And the fact that your main characters are a man with a prosthetic foot and doing his job without too much complication, and then a young female Latina who's in charge of the FBI unit, this is not the typical things that we are used to seeing in these kinds of books.
Jeff and I felt that it's not just inclusivity, which is obviously very important. It's not just diversity. It's also the fact that when you create a character, when you create heroes who have been forced to overcome adversity, you already are investing the reader with them from the start, because the reader is rooting for them because of just the reason, Dianne, you articulated, that they're different. They don't fit the norm. They're not regular. Michael is an ISB agent, but he had to go through arduous training and he refused to take any breaks or anything. I have to prove to myself, not just to you, that I can handle the rigors of this job. Mm-hmm. So one of my favorite scenes in the book is when he climbs Angel's Landing, when he gets to Zion. For an able-bodied person to climb Angel's Landing is a big accomplishment. To see a person with a prosthetic foot climbing Angel's Landing is even more of an achievement, an accomplishment that makes the reader root for him more, just as they're rooting for Gina, because she has already overcome incredible odds to get to where she is.
The other reason we had Michael have a prosthetic foot is because of the incident that happened at Rainier where he lost his wife and lost his foot. Here's a man who has to wear his grief every single day.
And that does make you connect more to the character too, understanding what he's working through.
Exactly.
We know, and I think characters like this, though, are just so representative of the world we actually live in.
They are.
Yeah.
And they're also that way emotionally. I mean, Gina's relationship in flashbacks with her father, Michael's relationship with a 15-year-old boy that he meets on the site of the toppled Statue of Liberty in the rubble. Mm-hmm. The boy is the only eyewitness. And Michael becomes very protective of him, makes arguably a misjudgment about what happens forward. But the reason he does that is because he sees in that boy who's lost his family, who's lost everything. He sees himself because he had lost his wife. So their relationship, which in a book that takes place over such a short period of time and has such a rapid fire pace, it's very difficult to develop secondary relationships. But not only did we develop that relationship, not only is one of the most harrowing scenes in the book, Michael saving the boy or trying to save the boy, the only eyewitness, from a contract assassin in the hospital where he's been placed. Not only that, it's this fact that we like what we were doing so much. Jeff had an important note, an important way forward about this relationship, which I thought Jeff was great. Why don't you take it from there?
I'm not sure what you're hinting at, John, actually.
The idea that we needed closure for Danny, for the boy.
Oh,
The idea,
yes. Oh, of course.
yeah.
Yes, because when we finished the original draft, we didn't really have closure for Danny at all. And we went back and looked and said, wait a minute, what happened with Danny? And so I think having the closure at the end, along with the vision that we had from the beginning on how the book was going to end, I think wrapped everything up super nicely. And we have a lot of people asking us if Danny's going to be coming back, which is neat to see.
It is. You've struck gold when readers are asking for a character to come back who you never intended to even have a major role in the book.
Yeah.
So we had a lot of fun creating out-of-the-box characters. I might mention too, Dianne, there's a secondary hero, a third hero who has a POV, an individual point of view, who's an 18-year-old Native American boy. He's tracking something. He's tracking a shipment of one of the key plot points in the book. He's tracking a shipment because he thinks it's about the environment, and he's part of a group that's protecting the environment. It turns out to be something much different. So he becomes the ultimate reluctant hero. And he was so much fun to write for that reason. Because also, he's a kid who doesn't have a lot of respect from his Native American tribe. He's trying to prove himself. This becomes his rite of passage. At 18, if he succeeds, if he survives, he's going to become a man in Native American culture. So the challenge of doing a series and doing a book like this is it's a thriller. It's supposed to be something you can't stop reading. Mm-hmm. But the reason you can't stop reading it, and here's the challenge, is to create characters that the reader makes an instant emotional investment in. I think part of the great thing of being inclusionary in this book is having characters who have so much that defines them as heroes in ways that are not traditional to the thriller.
I think you definitely have captured that interest and empathy in the reader, the way that you wrote the story. The characters do really start to make you care about them. You care what happens to Danny. Whenever he's gone, you're like, okay, wait a minute, who's watching him? Is he okay? So now, is this going to be a series?
Yes. And in fact, from the topic we were discussing earlier, just wait and see what we've got next.
See, and unfortunately, since we don't have video, you didn't see my little yay move when you said that.
And the great thing about the second book, which is called Cold Burn, it's into the home stretch now, but just about 3/4 of the way done in first draft, which is the most important stage. And it does all the things that people loved about Leave No Trace, but it does them in a different way. It has an entirely different setting. We're up in Alaska for most of the book. We're also in the Everglades, and we're in Glacier Bay National Park, and we're also in the Everglades in Florida. Nice contrast there. So it's a lot of fun because it doesn't feel redundant. Mm-hmm. Does it, Jeff? It doesn't feel like we're doing the same thing, only different.
Yeah.
It feels fresh. It feels original. It feels like something we haven't seen before for the second time, instead of just rewriting the same book again. So a lot of fun, because the great thing, here's the definition of a great series, Dianne. You can start the series in any book, in any order, and not realize that you missed anything. But it makes you want to go back and read all the books you didn't catch, and also go forward and pick up where you left off. If you can do that in a series, so every book reads like a standalone, but it's actually a continuation, you have struck a very high bar.
That would be a very tough thing to accomplish. That does take a really special, talented author to be able to do that kind of thing. You see so many anymore that each book in the series seems to be the same characters. They just have the same plot line. It's just the person who's killed is different. The person who discovers the body is different. But a lot of them feel like the same story over and over.
One of the beautiful things about the parks is each one is so vastly different from the other.
Great
That
point.
gives John and I an opportunity to just totally have fun and explore all these different avenues and stories.
One thing that I definitely want to ask about this, because I cannot imagine writing with a partner. I am such a control freak. And whenever I was going through college, the thing that I feared the most was a group project.
Ah,
How do you make this work? How do you come together to do one story?
I think the most
John is amazing.
no, I think the most important thing, Dianne, is as writers, as a writer or as singular or plural, in this case, plural, you have to know what your strengths are. And you also have to acknowledge what your weaknesses are, what your limitations are. We complement each other perfectly because everything I need more help with, Jeff is brilliant at. First of all, he and I have worked on books before because he basically gave me the endings to 2 or 3 books in my Caitlin Strong series that were languishing because I didn't know how to end them. I had boxed myself into a corner. So I knew Jeff was brilliant at structure. And I'll say this. Writing a book, if you have a great story to tell, is easy. Coming up with the great story to tell, that's the biggest challenge. So having someone like Jeff that I can call on the West, he's on the West Coast, I'm on the East Coast. So obviously I can call him at 11 o'clock at night, my time. It's only 8 over there. And I can say, Jeff, I just had a thought, ... And we'll knock things around. So although I do the bulk of the writing on the early draft, and then he edits and adds his 2 cents, even though the bulk of the words may be coming out of my computer, everything that's coming out is something we've discussed, something we've hashed over, something I'll go, oh my God, I just realized something. Because I used the term organic earlier, Dianne. Nothing is more important in a book than having it be organic in the sense that it doesn't feel overly structured. It feels like life. It feels like it's unfolding and you're surprising yourself. And as a writer, you have to have the awareness, the sensitivity, and the ability to realize what you're doing is taking you in the direction you should not be going. There are so many examples of this from both books that something just didn't feel right at the time. I'll give you one example, then turn it over to Jeff. We thought we were done with Leave No Trace, pretty much. Just finish work on it, kind of like painting the inside of the house after everything else is done. I called him up one day and I said, Jeff, who's the villain in this book? And what makes them the villain? And what I had realized, there are 2 villains in this book. One is a fanatical ex-general who's an ultra-right-wing nationalist, and the other is a man who hates the country, hates the national parks, hates everything for entirely different reasons. And it felt like neither one of them was cast properly. So we went back in at the 11th hour together. We thought it out, we hashed it out, and then we created an entirely new background for both these guys. We created the moment where they came together. We created their motivation, how much they knew, what they didn't know, how they enlisted the help of others. You have to be, and this is the point I'm getting at, you must learn to be objective about your own work. You've got to be able to evaluate your work as the first person to read it, not just as the person who wrote it.
I think that's important.
One of the things that John forgot to mention in that particular scene he's talking about and background is that we were actually able to find a historical thing that actually happened that we were able to put into his backstory. Again, trying to make it as accurate as possible.
And that
And I'm the detective.
Yes. And the fact is, Jeff's not giving himself enough credit because this was all him. And it was basically the fact that part of Mount Rainier was when Rainier was expanded, they used eminent domain, the Park Service, to take over land in Washington State. and they took this man, this villain's land away. And it created a Ruby Ridge-like situation where he refused to leave, and federal marshals and the FBI and, Steve McQueen and the Texas Rangers showed up, because what he was doing was wrong. He was squatting on land that was now the government's. But what happens as a result of that is the motivation for what he's doing now. And that's key. So what Jeff is saying and not giving himself enough credit for is we were able to take the actual history of the national parks and make it work for us in the creation of the villain's motivation for wanting to overthrow the U.S. government and kill 10 million Americans in the process. And he's not a cartoon. He's not a caricature. Mm-hmm. He's just a guy who's got power and has some skills and access that allows him, that enables him to do the things he wants to do in this book.
Listening the way that you two go back and forth, I'm really curious. I mean, because you sound like you have to be good friends in real life. How long have you known each other?
Close to 20 years.
Oh, wow. How did you meet?
I mentioned in my initial bio that I'm the co-executive director for Thriller Fest. Mm-hmm. Thriller Fest is where I met John. I had been reading John's books since the late 80s. I'd see them in the Walden's books on display and I just buy it without even reading what the book was about because I was such a huge fan. And then the very first Thriller Fest in New York, I went and he was the one author I wanted to meet because I was such a huge fan. And I, brought my books and everything. And we hit it off and became great friends. And if you told me in the late 80s that someday I'd be writing a book with him and be friends with him, I would have thought you were nuts.
And of course, I am nuts. So, but that means so much to me. And Jeff is a master of the craft in that he reads every thriller, it seems like, that's ever published. He knows, like me, he understands the tradition and the legacy of this genre. I remember what it was like as a little boy reading Doc Savage and the Executioner series. That's kind of where I started after I went from James Bond, the Ian Fleming series, into those books. And I remember what it felt like just to read a book from cover to cover in a single day without moving. And what I've tried to do with every one of my books over the course of 40 years, and what I think is most emblematic of Leave No Trace, is we want it, because both of us are the same in our tastes of books. We want it to give our readers the same experience reading Leave No Trace that I got from the Monterazi Circle, that I got from the Holcroft Covenant, Robert Ludlum, that I got from Firestarter. Why am I mentioning these books? Because good writers borrow, wrote Victor Hugo. Great writers steal. And I started my career stealing from the books and the stories and the authors that I liked the most. So this book, that's the effect we want it to have on people who read it. We want them to have the same feelings that we had from the time, I think both of us, Jeff, were boys reading.
Yep.
Until now. You want to sweep them away and take them into a different place. So they're no longer in their world. They've been transported to our world, the world of Leave No Trace, the world of Michael Walker and Gina Delgado. And the bottom line, I cannot stress this enough, Dianne, when I talk to writers and they say, what's the most important thing? What's the most important thing? And I've answered that question 100 different ways. Now I answer it only one way. Not just tell a great story. That's what I used to say. Now I say, have fun telling a great story. Because if the writer is not having fun writing it, how can we expect the reader to have fun reading it?
That's a great point.
One of the other things I want your listeners to understand is, we're talking about all this action, we're talking about these characters, but the book is also a love letter to the folks who work for the Park Service, because we didn't want to have all this stuff happen and then have someone who actually works for the Park Service read it and go, oh, they got the details right, but we come across pretty badly. Mm-hmm. So the book is actually dedicated to them because they do such an amazing job keeping the legacy alive for future generations. And That was one of the other reasons we went to the National Park Conservation Association, was to make sure we were not going to offend them in any way.
Dianne, spoiler alert.
Yeah.
When Jeff first called me about this, when we're talking about the national parks, and the first thing I said was, well, we got to blow up the Statue of Liberty on page 1. Now, Jeff tells that story a lot. But what we don't tell enough, and again, here's the spoiler alert, is he had a condition. There was a caveat.
I had so many conditions.
We had a lot of conditions, Jeff. I broke every one. No, I didn't. Jeff's condition was, if we're going to blow it up, if we're going to topple it, because it's made of copper, so you can't blow it up. You can, It'll get bent, it'll get, damaged when it topples, but it's not like concrete. It's not going to just turn to rubble. He said, if we're going to topple it, the last scene of the book, we have to raise it again. We have to show that it's back, that America has won, that the bad guys hurt us, but they didn't destroy us. We won in the end. It was always going to be thrillers. Look, it's a series, so the heroes survive. That's not a mystery. But the notion is, I believe in happy endings. I believe you read books as a catharsis that don't unfold necessarily like real life. In real life, the good guys don't always win. The bad guys win far too often in real life. So people aren't reading books like ours. They're not reading a book like Leave No Trace to see the bad guys win. Because that's their life. That's what they're exposed to every day. So that scene to me is, I think it's one of the most perfect conclusions, the most perfect final shots, to use a movie term, that I've ever seen in thriller fiction. Because it says so much, just the image of the cranes lifting it back up on a temporary pedestal, supported by scaffolding and everything. It says it all.
I think people always crave closure to a story, and that's like perfect closure.
Yes.
Agreed.
Now, this is the part of the show where we like to do 5 quick questions that never turn out to be quick, but it's a great way to get to know you as people. Are you ready?
We're ready.
So question 1, dog or cat person?
Dog.
Doggy.
Now, do you own any pets?
No.
No.
So you like them, but not in your house.
Well, Jeff has me, Dianne. So I'm very high maintenance. You've got to water me twice a week and make sure there's food in my bowl. It's a big responsibility for Jeff, but he handles it well.
My in-laws live next door to us, and we have a gate that opens between our houses, and they have 2 dogs. And so those dogs are over here half the time.
Oh, so it's kind of like having
we
step
sort of
dogs.
share dogs. Yeah, exactly.
That's the perfect situation. It's like other people's children. They go home.
Yeah, you get to play with them. You don't have to pick up their poop. You don't have to buy all of the food. You just get the fun part.
Exactly. And they're sweet doggies.
Oh, that's always good. Question 2. What was the last book you read for pleasure?
Just finished Michael Connelly's Resurrection Walk, the latest Lincoln Lawyer novel.
Since I do a lot of reviewing, and so does John, I read for pleasure nonfiction. Mm-hmm. And the last book I read that for pleasure for nonfiction was a book called Surely You Can't Be Serious, The True Story of Airplanes. So it was a behind the scenes, one of my absolute favorite films of all time.
That's a thing in our house. If anybody says, Shirley, like, don't call me Shirley.
Let me add one thing. I also, in the nonfiction space, I just finished a book about the making of one of my favorite movies of all time, which was Chinatown. Oh. And what struck me about the book was how so much of the greatest content in film's history was an accident. That everything went wrong and yet the movie turned out great. Jaws, The Godfather, Chinatown, Casablanca. It's amazing. You may think you're in control when you make a movie, but so many things have to go right, and you're not in control of so many other things. That's why writing books is so much more fun, because you are in control when you're writing a book. You are not in control when you're writing a movie or you're making a movie.
And we don't have to worry about budgets.
Yeah.
Exactly.
See, now hearing selections like that, it makes me question my choice of nonfiction books, because I tend to read things more like A Killer by Design by Dr. Anne Burgess. It's like how
Oh,
Murderers,
sure.
Mindhunters, and My Quest to Decipher the Criminal Mind, or the Poison Bible for writers and things like that. My husband gets worried sometimes.
My wife doesn't like thrillers at all, so it's fun when she's reading the stuff I write with John, and she's a scientist,
Oh,
and
wow.
so she helps us with the science aspects of things. And sometimes she'll just, give me a look like, "Okay, I'm wondering about you now."
But that's
She
cool.
hates me. She hates me because
No, she
I'm
doesn't.
no. But
She
the
does
thing is,
not
I don't
hate you.
take no for an answer. If I want to do something in a book, I would have no, no, no. Don't tell me we can't do it. We're going to do it. Tell me
We
a
just have to,
credible way that we could make it
yeah,
sound like we know what we're talking about. You know, because we're
yeah.
dealing even in this book with things technologically that don't exist today. It's basically we're making something up. The kind of explosion that's going to happen in the climax if Michael doesn't succeed. It's unprecedented. There's never been anything like this. So we're making it up, and we need to find credible people to tell us how to sound like we know what we're talking about.
Hmm.
And that's been so much fun to do, talking to people that you wouldn't necessarily be talking to otherwise, and they love talking about their expertise.
Oh, yeah. That's why I started
Yeah.
this podcast, was so I get to do it every week.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, absolutely. I hear you.
Okay, so question 3. If Leave No Trace should become a movie at some point, who would you want to play the two main characters?
Um,
Ooh.
I can answer the Michael Walker character. His name is Christopher Palaha. He's an actor on Hallmark films, and he's also been in Wonder Woman 84 and the last Jurassic Park World movie. And he actually is someone who read in advance of this book and gave us some great feedback and said, "Oh, I'd love to play him." And from that point on, like, I'd love to have you play him. So he's who I always see as Michael.
And what about Gina?
I think for Gina, I don't know if Ava Mendez is too old to play that role now. I mean, Gina Rodriguez, I think it would be very disingenuous to cast anyone but a Latina actress to play
Mhm.
Latina. So I think it's
100%.
important. Now, I don't necessarily feel that way about, we don't need to get an actor who's missing a foot to play Michael.
Yeah.
To quote Laurence Olivier, you don't have to die to play dead. Not all method acting, but if we were casting someone in a wheelchair, I would feel it was important to cast someone who really is in a wheelchair, if at all possible. Sometimes it's just not possible.
Hmm.
You just can't do it. But there are a lot of great Latina actresses out there, some of which I'm probably not even familiar with. But I think on Ava Mendez, Gina Rodriguez, there are a few others. And if we were not going to make her a Latina, if she wasn't, then we would have to change her background.
So now, question 4. If you had to pick one of the books that you have written and live in that world for a month, which book would you want to pick?
Oh my God.
Well, I'd have to say Leave No Trace for sure, just because there's so many parks we visit in this book, and it's so exciting and fun. And honestly, I'd love to hang with Michael and Gina.
The worlds I fashion in thrillers are so dramatic and fast paced. I wouldn't want to go live within any of them, to tell you the truth. But seriously, if I had to pick, this is tough. I've been lucky in that I've done some smaller books. For a book called Hope Mountain on adaptive skiing, I spent time learning how to ski. And for my book Dolphin Key, which is about dolphin human therapy, I swam with dolphins down in Key Largo. So let me answer the question this way, Dianne. It's not a question of which books I'd like to find myself in. It's looking for excuses to actually do it, to immerse myself in the world as much as possible of the heroes that I'm creating. If I were a method writer as opposed to a method actor, maybe I would have tried to walk around with crutches for a week to know what Michael went through when he lost his foot. Maybe that would have informed me better. I don't have that kind of ambition. I think there's no substitute for the imagination, I guess is what I'm getting at. But it's fun to experience as much as you can of what the character experiences, because you will understand them better. but you don't have to experience their pain. As I said, you don't have to die to play dead if you're an actor.
I would say also, if I could be stationed on the Starship Enterprise, I would do that in a heartbeat as long as I was not
Oh
wearing
my
a red
God.
shirt.
No kidding, right?
Didn't we all want to be on the Starship Enterprise?
Yeah.
Oh,
That's
absolutely.
like at some point be the captain. It's funny. I think if you ask me that question about other people's books or about TV shows and movies, I'd have a better answer for you. But my own stuff, I'm creating worlds I don't want to live in. That's why I'm creating them. That's why people are buying the books, because bad stuff is going to happen, you know?
So now, question 5. What is the best part about writing as a team versus writing as a solo author?
Jeff, you got to go first on that one.
In all honesty, when the idea is there and you have this vision of this great story and great characters, working with John, the phrase two heads are better than one fits so perfectly here, because what I envisioned and what the book actually is now is so much better and so much richer and deeper. And it has that oomph that when I was trying it initially, I was lacking.
And I think from my perspective, early on in my career, for years, I had a tradition where I'd always, there'd be a big climax at the end of my Blaine McCracken series. And I went to Williamsburg for one book, and I went to Disney World for The Fires at Midnight, and Washington, D.C. for Day of the Delphi. Whatever I was going to blow up or lay waste to, I would go and visit. Well, as I've gotten older, I don't like to travel. I like to sit. I like to write. I like my life. Jeff and I were just on tour, which reminded me of why I hate to travel. Even though it was a great trip, it was still hectic and running from airport to airport.
I apologize.
Yeah, but that's okay. But the thing is, Jeff makes me better by enabling me not to have to do what I'm not as good at as he is. His passion for the parks and the fact that he loves visiting the parks so much, frankly, means I don't have to go. And that's okay, because if one of us has that passion and is bringing it to the table, the other one doesn't necessarily need it. So this goes back to one of the earlier questions about why we work so well together. We're just perfect fits. It's like we're two jagged edges, and when you fit us together, it's just a perfect symmetry. And it's impossible to get mad at Jeff. He should be mad at me all the time for driving him crazy. But Jeff is so patient with me and so tolerant of my whims and inability to commit to something because I write from the inside out. But he offers enough discipline that keeps me, as I said earlier, on the rails, and it makes us a perfect fit.
I could not be happier working with John.
You guys seem to work off of each other very well.
Well, we were your first dual interview, right? The first time you've interviewed two authors at once?
Yeah, for the podcast. Yeah.
There you go. Okay.
And you'll never do it again.
Actually, I was worried that it would be a little bit confusing for the listeners, but your voices are so different and your delivery is so different. I think it's going to be very easy for people to tell who's speaking.
Or they can just
That
blurt
sounds
out
good.
my parts and listen to Jeff alone.
I was going to suggest that to her and bribe her a little bit to do so, but okay.
So now let's remind everybody who you are and where they can find your book.
Go, John.
I'm John Land, and Jeff, you're Jeff Ayers. So, but you can find the book. We're an Amazon Editor's Pick of the Month for March. We got to give a shout out to Amazon for recognizing us that way. But you can get the book anywhere. Local bookstore, if they don't have it in stock, they can have it put to you in 24 hours. So if you prefer independence, go there. If you like Amazon, go there. If you're a Barnes & Noble, Books A Million person, big chain person, go there. I grew up on Walden Books, mall stores. I miss them every day.
Agreed.
But I also love indie bookstores. So wherever you buy your books, you can get Leave No Trace.
And it's so much fun walking into a store like my local independent here and seeing it on the shelf. It's so exciting.
That's what I'm hoping for one day. Whenever I actually get my writing career going, that's what I want to do. I want to be able to walk into a store and see one of my books on the shelf.
It never gets old. I tell people that maybe that was that first time where I didn't sleep the night before I knew I was going to see my first ever finished copies of a book. The magic of opening the box for the first time and pulling out the first copy. You know the cover, you know the inside, you know all that. But holding it in your hands. Now, Jeff, what was it like for you when that happened with Leave No Trace?
When the box arrived, I had it in my kitchen and I was opening the box and my daughter comes in and she goes, "Oh, what's this?" and starts to help me. It's like, no, I have to do this myself.
Mm-hmm.
And then pulling it out of that box, I almost wept just because you're holding the vision in your hand. And it is an experience that, I'll treasure forever. And I know I'll do the same for the next one.
No doubt about it.
Yep.
That is just absolutely amazing. And of course, for everybody who's wanting to find you and your book, there will be live links in the description of the podcast and on our website at burkhartbooks.com. And you two are going to be in Book Banter magazine, which will also have live links to your social media and this episode.
Awesome.
Thank you.
And just so you know, there is also a year-end book buying guide that drops in November before Thanksgiving holiday shopping begins. And you will also be in there.
Ooh, thank you.
Thank you, Dianne.
Appreciate that.
See, there's benefits to coming and talking to me.
Absolutely. This has been great. We so appreciate you taking the time to listen to us. And I don't know what time it is over there now, but go have a stiff drink. I have that effect on people.
Well, it's after 4:00 here, so that's possible.
Yeah, I need to do that now.
Thank you so much for being here. This has been absolutely fabulous. And I hope whenever you have another book in the series ready to go, that you will come back and talk to me again.
We would love that.
For sure.
So there you have it, folks. My interview with the writing team behind A.J. Landau and the thriller Leave No Trace, authors Jeff Ayers and John Land. They were so much fun to talk to, and I cannot wait for the next book. I have just about finished. I have like 2 chapters left to read, which I'm going to do this afternoon to finish Leave No Trace. And oh my gosh, it is so good. I love so many elements about this book. If you love thrillers, please go pick up a copy of Leave No Trace by A.J. Landau, and you will be very grateful that you did. Now, as promised, I'm going to tell you about the other authors that I have coming up very soon. I am talking next week with Teresa Payton, who was the first female CIO in the White House, and she has a new version of her book, Manipulated: Inside the Cyber War to Hijack Elections and Distort the Truth. That is going to be such an incredibly timely discussion to have. Her interview is going to be coming May 29th, so don't miss out. Right now, if you go pick up our latest issue of Book Banter magazine for just $2.99 on our website, burkhartbooks.com, you can get a preview of Teresa, her background, and her book that we will be discussing on the podcast next month. Now, next week, we have Nandita Godbole, an incredible cookbook author who has several cookbooks out right now that help people become less stressed when making real, authentic Indian food. And her recipes are fantastic and easy to follow. It does take the stress out of trying to make authentic Indian food. Because as you'll hear in our interview, I told her, I've made Indian food several times, but I have never done it with confidence. So I really can use her help on that. Another incredible interview that I have coming up pretty soon. If you like true crime stories, I have a former detective from Florida who worked some very high profile cases who's going to be coming on to talk about his book, CSI, the Casey Anthony child murder case. He's also working on a second book, and I'm hoping that we can get a little preview of that one as well. So if you're a fan of true crime, keep watching our schedules for that interview to come up this summer. And of course, I'm still working on my medical memoir, Free Bad Haircut with Each Craniotomy. If you pick up our latest issue of Book Banter magazine, you can find out more about that. And I think in a future episode, we might do a little bit of a reading from my book to give you an idea of my style and how this book is going. So be sure to subscribe to this podcast. keep following us on our social media because we have got so many incredible things coming up and we're planning a whole lot more. So be sure to follow along because if you love books like we do, you do not want to miss this podcast or a single issue of our magazine. And now you know what time it is, folks. It's time for you all to go forth and be very happy.